Welcome everyone to our Town Hall series, Equity Starts with Access. My name is Jamie Bruni-Miles, President and CEO of the YMCA San Francisco and co-moderator for tonight's discussion. Through the Town Hall series, we seek to create a space for community members and thought leaders to engage in meaningful conversations. In the previous Town Halls, we discussed the pandemic's impact on our youth, education system, and mental health while exploring some key initiatives to support our most vulnerable population during these times. This evening, we'll be exploring the exciting transportation challenges and opportunities in front of us, which include the intersection of transportation, post-pandemic recovery, and equity. How micromobility is playing an instrumental role in transportation recovery, the importance of public-private partnerships to fulfill recovery and transit goals, transportation justice and how to increase equity in public transportation and new mobility, and plans to expand transit and increase ridership this summer and beyond. First and foremost, I want to thank our panelists. Lateefah Simon. Lateefah Simon is a nationally recognized advocate for civil rights and racial justice in Oakland and the Bay Area. She's been a president of the Condé Nandi Foundation since 2016 and serves on the BART board. Since 2015, Lateefah also serves as member of the Board of Trustees for the California State University, the nation's largest public university system, and state officials often turn to her for strategic advice on policy matters related to racial justice. Lateefah is a fierce advocate for civil rights, racial justice, and juvenile justice. In 2003, she became the youngest woman to receive a MacArthur Fellowship for her leadership of the Center for Young Women's Development, now the Young Women's Freedom Center, from the age of 19, as a renowned speaker on social justice and transportation issues, as well as an active user of BART services, which has oversight in her role. Miller Nuttall. Miller manages government relations for Lyft's transit, bikes, and scooter business. Before Lyft, Miller was deputy director of Bike Austin, and before that, campaign director at Transportation Alternatives in New York City, where he ran campaigns for protected bike lanes, pedestrian safety, infrastructure, and Vision Zero safety policies. He holds a Master in Public Administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and Bachelor of Arts and University Science from Wesleyan University. Thank you for joining us tonight, panelists. As a community, we're beginning to recover from the traumatic events of 2020. COVID-19 struck as an invisible enemy responsible for more than 600,000 deaths in the US and loss of millions of jobs. Secondly, COVID-19 has heightened our collective awareness of racial inequities that has existed for centuries. Both issues significantly impact our communities in complex ways that are often hard to comprehend. Now more than ever, we are pressured to find innovative solutions that ensure our communities can thrive. Tonight, we convene key leaders to discuss the changing landscape of transportation. I'd also like to introduce my co-moderator for tonight, Franco Finn from Alaska Airlines. Franco Finn oversees external relationship efforts in California for Alaskan Airlines. This includes the primary focus on the Bay Area market and airports, as well as the Southern California region, where he's the overall go-to liaison in the state. By day, he's with Alaskan Airlines, and by night, you'll find him as an arena, host MC, and hype man for the NBC's Golden State Warriors over the last 2 decades and counting. Thank you, Franco, for moderating with me. Our format tonight is to ask the panelists questions for 45 minutes, provide you an opportunity for questions for the last 15 minutes. To ask questions, please enter them in the Q&A section. Now let's get started, and Franco, first question.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for the introduction. Thank you to our panelists that we have here. Thank you, Miller. Thank you, Lateefah. This is great. Thank you for allowing myself to represent, obviously, Alaska Airlines. And, being in transportation myself, we all know that this pandemic has certainly changed our business in many, many, many ways. And so we're going to hear from some of our panelists here, our experts, on how the pandemic has changed their business and how the public perceives their agency or their company, especially as we recover from this pandemic. And I just know, and speaking on behalf of Alaska, we've really had to, change a lot of our safety measures right from the get-go. People didn't want to travel for a while. You probably had the best deals. We were giving them away during 2020. But I'm really proud of what our airline has done in terms of, transporting people to and from their places safely, the public perception and everything. And also, our work in the community, really, being involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really moving that forward, not only with our employees, but with opportunities. And we'll get into that a little bit, but I want to talk about this pandemic and with our two panelists here, Miller and and Latifa, let's talk about this pandemic and how, it's exposed so many existing inequities that we have in our communities. I'm sure it's unraveled a lot of problems and issues that we face in our communities as well. But I want to know, how does transit accessibility perhaps offer a solution? And how is your agency or company working to address these types of challenges that we face here as we move forward in recovery? I'm just going to kind of point out, maybe we'll start with Latifa.
Sure.
On behalf of the BART's perspective,
yeah.
Tell us, how's the pandemic changed BART's vision on inequities in our communities?
So this is a huge question. And I'm going to do my best to get in there. You're probably going to have to cut me off, but I'll take a couple of minutes. I want to be clear, when I joined the BART organization in 2016 as an elected member, so it's not my full-time job, the BART board, it's one of only 3 transit institutions, public transit institutions in the country that has an elected board. So you got to run for office for a job that everyone's pretty much mad at you every day. But why I decided to run, Franco, which is really important, is I'm transit dependent. I'm legally blind. I've never driven a car. And for me, at that stage of my life of being an activist and an organizer, fighting for a lot of the conditions that not just transit dependent people, but people of color and low income folks don't have access to, things that we know that would make their lives easier. When I lost my husband to cancer, I found myself back on the bus. He was a driver every single day with kids. And I didn't believe at the time that the BART Board of Directors was representing folks like myself, where transportation is not only sort of a right, it's critical. And I started studying under a number of folks who really helped me understand this philosophy of mobility justice, that in civil society, yes, we should care about the environment. Yes, we should care about freeways being not so crowded, but in a civil society, folks must have access to safe and affordable transit, to go to and fro, to be civically involved, to have access to education and healthcare. I can go on and on. Your question about COVID last year. Every year there is, on the BART Board of Directors, there is an election within the board to elect someone as president. I was elected president in January. It's a $2.4 billion institution of that board. And I gotta say, by March 14th, my world completely changed. In some ways, I felt like everyone in the Bay Area and actually around the world felt like a disabled person. And I say that with a lot of care. As a disabled person, there's a lot that I can do, and there's a lot that I can't do. When mobility was restricted, when folks had a harder time getting groceries or had a very difficult time being able to access things that they were normally able to do before the shutdown, their conditions changed. BART provided such an important service during the shutdown, because what we knew within 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and I'm going to stop here, of the shutdown happening, literally our streets were like ghost towns, but those trains kept running, because we know, not just in recovery, but we know during the shutdown, our nurses, our teachers, our nannies, our home cleaners, our bus drivers, right? Our grocery store workers, our working class, the Bay Area, the BART is the spine and it's the ecosystem of how people move. One of the things that's important to know is we went from 430,000 riders a day. In a week, we lost 80% of our ridership. And again, it continued to go down, right? But we needed, as president, I believe that it was so important to keep those trains running. Losing that ridership also meant losing the majority of our operating budget. BART, unlike many other transit systems, has an operating budget where 70% comes from what we call the fare box, when you pay. So we'll talk more about the safety and it's so many things we had to think about. But for me, the most important thing was to make sure that folks had access to transportation. Yes, we had to make some hard choices, like closing BART a little earlier, which was just devastating. But it was important to make sure that the railroad was running.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And indeed, I mean, BART was a lifeline. It's a lifeline for many people to connect from different parts of the Bay Area. We know it's a vast Bay Area, and it's hard to get to places. And this is a lifeline. It's a livelihood. And it's something that, you know, many people need to get to their jobs, just to live every day. And so thank you for sharing your perspective there. I'm going to point out, let's go talk to Miller on this, if you don't mind sharing a little bit. How does the pandemic change for your business, your agency with Lyft, or your company rather? Because it's definitely a different model. How's it affected what were pre-pandemic levels? What does it look like today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Lateefa put it really well. The pandemic made visible the sort of inequities that have been simmering in our society for generations. I think especially for those of us who have privilege in many different ways, it just brought to the fore the sort of inaccessible access that so many people face on a daily basis. I think one really stark example was what Lateefa was referring to there, you know, our essential workers, just how vital a role they play in our society day to day, keeping our economy, our society moving forward, and how disproportionately that group of folks relies on public transit and relies on shared mobility as their main mode of transportation to get to their job. That just emerged, rightfully so, as one of the central kind of narratives of the pandemic. I think one area where bike share can add value to the sort of the foundation of mobility, which is of course mass transit, BART, and other agencies, is being relatively nimble. You know, we have some fixed assets on the ground, but we can adjust things pretty quickly. So we, in the early days of the pandemic, stood up a critical workers program. We gave out free annual bike share memberships to over 35,000 essential workers. Those folks took over 350,000 trips getting to and from their work, whether they were a nurse or a bus driver. And I think that just, it really underscored the benefit of having these kinds of redundant systems, like a bike share system on top of a transit system. Giving people those options was so important during the pandemic. And then another way that having that sort of nimble nature of bike share really was useful is we were able to really quickly expand our service area ahead of what we had planned, because SFMTA did have to curtail some of their service, just the kind of unprecedented budget shortfalls that Lateefa was referring to. Like a lot of transit agencies around the country had to do the excruciating work of kind of triaging routes. And so we were able to help, for some people, fill those gaps while the service was temporarily down. So I think, you know, we were fortunate to be able to adapt in some ways, but of course, like every mobility option, you know, the pandemic just did impact, of course, like our daily operations and how many people were moving around, the sorts of origin and destination patterns that were there changed radically. But I think it's a reminder for us during the pandemic and as we emerge from it to double down on the programs that we're really proud of to increase access for people, especially at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Our Bike Share for All program, for instance, is $5 a year for the first year. It gives people unlimited access to our pedal bike program and discounted e-bike access. That is so vital as a lifeline for people, especially as people return to work, sometimes from long periods of unemployment, get back in the workforce and need an affordable way to get to work or access those really important BART lines or other main public transit lines. And of course, our partnerships with organizations like the Y or Transform in the East Bay, you know, those are the partnerships that allow our program to reach people who really need them, whether it's Bike Share for Youth with the Y or the programming we're doing with East Oakland Collective and others to give away free bike share passes. Those are the programs that are really vital to making sure that our service reaches the right people. So as we emerge, that's going to be our priority to double down on those programs.
Great. I love East Oakland Collective. Oh, that's awesome.
They're great. They're great.
I mean, how can people find out more about this? And, you know, just we have folks tuning in from all walks of life here, and, you know, some folks really are very concerned about these. Is there information that we can find on your websites or anything? I'm just throwing it out there. And if not, you know, no need to answer, but we can move on to the next question. But just wondering if, you know, how people can find out more about this and if there's anything they can do on their end. You know, I'm just throwing it out since we have, like I said, probably a diverse group of folks tuning in to this town hall today.
So with BART, it's a government institution, right? And our website is bart.gov, but we serve now 5 counties, right? So we opened up 2 stations that are getting closer to San Jose. Berryessa and Milpitas during the pandemic, because again, people still need to move. And that was a project that took 20 years just to build those two, monumental, those two stations. We hopefully will be opening in a few years in San Jose proper, in the middle of the city. But BART.gov, we discovered, and I'm sure this was true for Lyft as well, during the pandemic, people needed information daily. And so our communications department is run by just a brilliant team who also understood that communications is not about marketing necessarily all the time. In times of crisis, the most amazing way the communicator, the urban planner, all these folks who are working in these big institutions can communicate about shifts is to make sure that there's accessibility. Not everybody has a website, internet access. So we are also really, trying our hardest to communicate with community institutions. We were sending out mailers, and we had, survey takers in our stations for the staff that weren't driving trains. They were put all over the district, during the downtime to do education. So it was a really important thing for us. Right now, if you go to BART.gov, there's a COVID update that is updated daily, what's happening in the district. We've really took a lot of time to really clear our communications methods to make sure that they were easy and accessible. So BART.gov, it's a big website, but you can kind of find what you need on it now a little easier.
Yeah, and I find it too, just, from the airline's perspective, I mean, we were upfront about everything daily, communications. Like you said, it's not just used for marketing purposes and to promote and this and that. We were there to educate people about, what it takes, to be a safe airline, for us, because people were very scared to fly us. And we had, scientific, facts and to even prove it that, you cannot get COVID, you have a very small chance in our aircraft because we have HEPA filters rotating, all this stuff. But the education part, every day, our communications team were working round the clock. I mean, we were triple overtime at this point, just getting information. So it's good to know that you can navigate through there if you do have access to the internet onto the website, and there were daily updates if not, to get everyone going. Miller, did you want to add to that? We can move on to the next question. Otherwise, no worries.
No, I think that's it. If folks Google Bike Share for All, that's the income eligible program I was mentioning. So that's a great resource for people.
Awesome.
Bike Share.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you both for sharing that. Let's move on. Let's transition a little bit to workforce development here. Let's talk about, recruiting, retaining, developing perhaps employees, is critical to recovery. It's certainly critical to ours at Alaska Airlines. What we're doing is we're trying to fill in our pipeline. We know we need to be more diverse and inclusive, and we need to build equity and also just recruit the new generations of mechanics, pilots, flight attendants, you name it, just for the sake of our industry, because we don't have many in the pipeline. We need to keep refilling that, and we don't have diverse candidates as much as we'd love to. So we're making a conscious effort to really reach out and have more, folks in leadership and management, and really reach out to schools and education and do a whole blitz on just career pathways and opening up an industry, hopefully to folks that may never have an opportunity to even look into it, but we want to present that. Let's talk about your agency, your group here, thinking differently about maybe hiring practices, post-pandemic, especially tapping into the youth, the young adult workforce development and opportunities like that. Are there efforts from your agencies doing that to fill in the pipeline, to get workforce development going as we recover from this pandemic? Let's start with you, Miller, this time.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. Hiring a diverse workforce has been a priority for Lyft and for our operations partner in the bike share space for years. We, at the sort of local system level, we've invested a ton in partnerships that can help us identify talent, especially from marginalized communities in the neighborhoods where we're actually running our bike share systems. That's really important to us. So in Chicago, for instance, we partner with the Safer Foundation, which is an amazing organization that helps people re-entering society from being incarcerated, and create talent pipelines for those folks with barriers to traditional employment to get jobs on our operations teams. We run bike mechanic boot camp with some organizations in Chicago to train people up on the basics of bike maintenance so that we have a talent pipeline that can come and begin repairing bikes in our systems. Those sorts of partnerships, similar to how I was talking about the Bike Share for All program, and it only being really effective if you engage and fund organizations that are connected to the right communities. Those organizations are the critical interstitial tissue that gets us connected to the people who are going to be the best fit for our organization. And we are really proud that pretty much across the board, all of our operations positions pay a living wage. They come with benefits. These are real green jobs that are an economic lifeline for people. And so the more that we can partner with those organizations to get people into those jobs, it's about running a really good bike share system, but it's also about the sort of downstream effects that come with the impact on an individual's family and how they're able to sort of build a more comfortable life for themselves too. And by the way, just a quick plug, we're always looking for great partners in the workforce development space. I'm sure many of you all are facing the sort of complexities in the labor market right now. So people who have those connections in the community, please feel free to reach out to me and I can get organizations connected with our operations teams too.
Okay, thank you, Miller. And then actually, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie because we have another great panelist joining us. And Jamie, go ahead and introduce who else we have joining our conversation here.
Director Tomlin, thanks for joining us as well. As you know, he's the director of Muni. Since December 2019, oversees Muni parking, traffic engineering, bicycle, pedestrian safety, Miller, transportation accessibility, and traffic regulation for the city and county of San Francisco. So thank you, Director Tomlin, for joining us as well. And the few questions, if you want to add into the conversation, was mainly on inequities in communities that you've noticed through COVID. And we also talked about workforce development, if you'd like to add to that conversation, sir.
I'm sure I'd be happy to. And my apologies, I'm late. I had an incorrect link in my calendar, but that is now fixed. I'm happy to be here. Let me actually talk about hiring, because it is the most critical obstacle that stands in the way of Muni's recovery. We were expecting about this time to be laying off 20% of our workforce. And thanks to the changes that happened in Washington, we now have enough money, at least to cover our losses for this year. But we also now have a 15% overall vacancy rate. And in our core maintenance units, our vacancy rate runs from 20 to 40%. And in critical overhead lines functions, it is over 50%. So we have to do a massive amount of hiring just to begin our recovery. And we want to hire locally. Muni has a long history of hiring locally, particularly among communities of color, particularly in neighborhoods like Viz Valley and Bayview. We're now rebuilding our apprenticeship and internship programs and creating, fixing some obstacles in order to make sure that those programs lead directly into real jobs and jobs with career paths. Because that's actually one of the things that is great about working at a transit agency is our jobs are here for the duration. We will always have bus operators, no matter what the level of technology that autonomy offers. In San Francisco, we need bus operators. And very importantly, we need mechanics and machinists and custodians, jobs that need to evolve with technology. That equipment needs to be maintained. It's physical and real. And so we're really being conscious of how do we reach out to folks who are not interested in the college degree path, but are smart and creative and collaborative and entrepreneurial, and who are interested in being trained up into positions of leadership within the agency. Because who I want running the agency are people who know the ins and outs of how the agency is operated. So please do keep an eye out for positions. We're going to be releasing them a lot, all of which are available on our webpage. And again, particularly interested in smart, creative kids of color to come join us.
I love it. That's fantastic. Latif, did you want to maybe add something real short on there? I'm gonna.
I'll just be quick. I love Jess. I'll answer. You know, if you're looking for employment, you know, I think again we think about transit as being this great unifier. In so many ways. I will say just a quick caveat, Jeff's organization and BARD came together a couple of years ago to work with Baby Hunters Point Foundation, Urban Alchemy, to ensure that while there are so many issues around safety in our systems, any public space, but our elevators were a really important access point in our underground stations in San Francisco. And folks were having a very difficult time accessing those elevators because of biohazards and because of the sort of the unsolved nature of all of our cities in this country, urban spaces, not being able to do what we need to do around our houseless population. Folks seek refuge in tunnels, right? That's what happens. Jeff's organization and BART came together and found resources to hire men and women, most of them returning from jails and prisons and rebuilding their lives as elevator attendants. And so when you walk into Powell Street, you get on that elevator, you see that mama with that stroller. She's going into an elevator that is clean, that is well kept. And you see someone in that elevator with a clipboard keeping stats. And what we know is like over 90% of the people surveyed about their experience with now our new elevator attendant program have a good experience where for the most part, those elevators were unusable for years. So again, I think so much of the real challenges that the MTA has to face every single day. I grew up in San Francisco as a kid, riding all the bus lines that Jeff is running now. And as you know, as a San Franciscan or a Bay Area resident, so much of what makes San Francisco great is its deep access to public transportation. You can walk 3 blocks and you're going to find a bus stop. And if you think about Malvern, Arkansas, not so much, right? And so with all the problems that we have to face, COVID and post-COVID, to Jeff's point, this reality of making sure that our workers have a wonderful, wonderful pay is extremely important. Making sure that they're stable and making sure that they're there when the customers need them is extremely important. And BART was able to maintain our workforce throughout COVID. We're really proud of that.
That's good to know. Thank you so much for sharing that on the workforce development front. Let's transition over to public sentiment towards probably returning to public transit and micro mobility and the impact on the recovery. Talk about that and maybe the fears around public transportation today, right? With everything that's going on and sanitation being at the top of this and making sure, is it safe to get on these, on BART or on Lyft or, on Muni or whatnot? Can we talk about that a little bit? Maybe let's start with you, Jeff, from the SFMTA perspective. What's the public sentiment like right now? And what are you doing to kind of combat that, hey, it's safe to ride?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what's clear from the health science is that public transit is one of the safest places you can possibly be. It was not at all a vector for transmitting COVID or other diseases. And yet we also know that people don't make their decisions based upon the health science. They make decisions based upon emotion. So we're paying very careful attention to both our community survey data as well as our ridership patterns. One thing that we're seeing is that our weekend ridership is almost back to pre-COVID levels. On lines like the 14 Rapid on Mission Street and the 9 San Bruno, they are at, or in the case of the 9, exceeding pre-COVID levels. So ridership is back. Our problem is that the destinations aren't back. The financial district remains shut down. And our greatest fear is that we need to spend 1 year of revenue, 1 year of loss recovery. And San Francisco's downtown financial district, those office workers are not going to come back by December of this year. We've got at least a 5-year recovery that we've got to be prepared for. And therefore, we've got to be very cautious with spending our resources. It also means that we need to look at all the reasons why people are nervous about transit, including security concerns, particularly for our Asian Pacific Islander community that is generally afraid of an increase in violence during the COVID period, and that, that insecurity that one sees on transit, even though the numbers of passenger assaults on transit are way down. So we know that the game is really about changing public perception, but also making people feel more comfortable and safe, while at the same time continuing our efforts to make transit healthy and increase security.
Thank you for sharing. How about you, Latifa? Any perspective on that? What's the public sentiment like with BART, and how are you building that trust back?
It's such a great question. I'm a single mom, a widowed mom with a 9-year-old, and I get on BART every day. And why I'm on this board is I get it, right? I get it. Some people are having their very worst days when they get on that train. There are folks who haven't had the opportunity to seek the services and they find themselves in the tunnel. I get it. But what's been so important about last year, and again, I saw somebody talk about the bathrooms. Yes, they are finally going to be reopened. It's been since September 11th. It was really sort of federal, it was a federal mandate that underground bathrooms, and they're actually, most of them are still closed around the country, and in subways around the country. It's still the federal law or federal requirement that they're secured, but we're really working hard this year to get an exemption and open pilot a couple of bathrooms in our San Francisco stations. They're open in the other pieces of the other parts of the system that are above ground. But to your question, security is a real issue in any public space. You're in San Francisco, the place of my birth, my home city, and I am like, oh my goodness, until cities and counties figure out how to house and clothe folks who are having treat folks the worst moments of their lives, we're going to be struggling. On my Facebook page today, again, after 5-6 years of lobbying, my board, and with the help of folks like Bevan Dufty and Rebecca Salzman and others on the board, we were able to work with our police department to address the reality and look at data. If 47% of the folks who are calling BART police while they're in the system are calling because, again, not because of violence, but because somebody's having a mental health emergency, or they're dealing with drug use, or they're seeing stuff that makes them really uncomfortable. We have for so long in our system met that 47% with a badge and a shield and a gun. What we know and what data tells us is that folks who are like having really bad days and really kind of mostly to themselves, but making us uncomfortable, they must be met, not just with someone to give them a hug. I'm not saying that, not just a police officer to take them out of the BART station where they're gonna come right back in, they have no destination. BART is hiring right now 20 social service employees. We've never done that, but we understand that the data doesn't lie, and we have to coordinate with the cities and counties. You can't just put somebody off of a train. It's lazy, right? It doesn't make sense. You have to figure it out. No, we are not a social service organization, but we carry pre-COVID time for almost 500,000 people a day, now 80,000 people a day. The other thing that's important, outside of just the social services, folks, when you get on these big transit systems and it's at night, you do need to have call boxes. We restored our call boxes. Sometimes folks don't have access to cell phones, and you're at stations and they may be kind of desolate. It's important that people have access to staff. We also, one of the things that I thought was really important when I ran, as being a BART rider my whole life, you're not always seeing people, staff members. So instead of just hiring police officers, we instituted a program called the Ambassador Program. We do have armed officers as well, but again, for the majority, folks just need to see staff. And we need staff to be the eyes and the ears. And we've been hiring our ambassadors, our social workers. They're coming directly from the community to join with our progressive policing unit. But here's the deal. If you think about COVID cleaning, so much of the guidance changed over the course of the first year of the pandemic. But you know what? We heard folks loud and clear, like, clean these damn trains. I don't think, we're there where we want to be. But if we would have let go, for instance, of our custodial staff, if we would have let go of our train operators, during the deep dip in ridership, we wouldn't be able to have a system that's running in 50 stations over almost 200 miles right now. We're fully staffed, and our cleaning staff is on board. You've never seen the stations cleaner. Yeah, do I go on stations sometimes and it still feels kind of icky? That's why I'm on the board. But safety is a real issue in any public space now, because you have the ebbs and flows of the realities that's come out of the COVID crisis that has exposed inequities. Folks lost jobs. The folks who are working at home are not the folks who are still unemployed. Folks lost care. And so in Oakland and San Francisco, we're seeing upticks in violence. These are real things that come into all systems. So we just need to not, again, I go past the marketing. We need to go and be in a conversation about what's hard, and then we need to be worried about fixing it. And it is not about throwing people away. It is about addressing root causes. It's about working with the counties and acknowledging sometimes our systems don't feel safe. And we have to be real about that.
Lateefah, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in that conversation. Any one of the three, you represent large organizations, and sometimes it feels overwhelming. And you just talked about bringing it to the ground level and who needs you the most. So what can an individual do to influence the direction of your organizations to be part of the solution? We've talked about COVID. We got to think about the new norm. So what do I as an individual can do to change the system for the better? Anybody want to take that one?
I can start. So
Please.
Collective action is always easiest. Joining forces with your neighbors or your community in order to get educated and share resources in order to be heard. That's always a much more effective way of reaching us. And you can do that through your community-based organization or your board of supervisors members, through organizations like the San Francisco Transit Riders Union or SPUR. There are lots of ways to get engaged. I think for both of our agencies, our greatest fear right now is operating funds. We have money to cover our losses for this year, but not for next year or the year after or the year after that, let alone to cover the structural deficit that had been cutting muni service every year for nearly the last decade. So we're going to need a very, very strong community partnership in order to figure out how do we sustain the transit service that we had back in 2019, or better yet, get to the transit system that we really, really need and not have to be largely dependent upon passenger fares for delivering basic mobility to the people who need it the most.
I'll echo Director Tumlin there. I think just the broader point about collective action, joining, giving money to organizations that are organizing and lobbying for improved transit access, funding for transit, funding for bike share, funding for all of these things. That's the best use of your time. I'll also just note there are major conversations happening at the federal level around an infrastructure package currently. I'm sure you've seen it in the headlines. People in a big chunk of the Bay Area are represented by one of the most powerful people in Congress, conveniently. And so getting engaged in some of those organizations and reaching out to your elected leaders to ask them that they prioritize funding for public transit, build on some of the progress the Biden administration and Congress have made so far, to not only keep agencies afloat, but think about what are the next big capital projects that are needed to make public transit accessible to even more people. It's such a big fork in the road that we're facing right now between doubling down on investment in public transit and things and programs like bike share versus backsliding to an era when cars were the dominant way that people got to work, and what the federal government and the sort of the various layers of government underneath that do on a really big scale to direct funding to public transit. It will determine which road we end up taking. So in terms of the impact that an individual can have in getting organized and talking to your neighbors and joining and funding organizations, the moment is right now, and you can have a really outsized impact on the future of transit in the Bay Area, but really just across the country too.
Thank you. And Lateef, I'd like you, because you're a lived experience of a user now being part of solutions. So you want to add to that conversation as well?
Yeah, just briefly. I'm deeply appreciative of the question. I'm deeply appreciative of this movement that we're seeing. I've become a transit nerd. I was a policy criminal justice nerd before I got on the BART board. And I am wickedly interested, not just about the now. There is a program that Jeff and my team are in with 27 other providers. We're all thinking about the next 50 years. There were decisions that were made 50 years ago when BART opened. It opened on, I believe it was September 11th, almost 50 years ago, that first ride. And the institution was, frankly, and again, if you read the scholarship and you look at the documents, the institution was created because there was so much white flight out of the cities. Right, and you had suburbs. Yes, Fremont is a suburb. Concord is a suburb, right? Even Richmond is a suburb, and they needed to get folks back in downtown every day. So there were many decisions made about the track, about the railroad, where it would go, where it wouldn't go, what spaces would be toppled over, like West Oakland or parts of South Berkeley, to make sure that the train was accessible. Those decisions still have great, gross impacts on particular communities. As we think about a second tube, as we're thinking about figuring out a new a formula for funding public transportation, that it is as core as streets and roads, it is infrastructure, it is core to our cities and our communities' ability to collectively survive. We need to be thinking about it depends on how old you are here, but what your great-great-great-grandchildren or your grandchildren or your nieces and nephews will experience in their old age, how they will get around, how they will be able to access food and healthcare. What will their cities look like? What will the lowest come neighborhood? How will they have access? Will they not have to walk up 6 hills to get to an affordable means of transportation? I think with the Lyft experience, and I love that you're on the call, Miller, because as someone who has to take 3 or 4 sometimes different modes of transportation a day, I got to tell you, I sometimes I take a Lyft to the train station, and I get on the train. I'm going to lobby in Sacramento, and then I got to catch a cab, and then I get off the train later, and then I catch BART, and then I catch the AC Transit home. It's tough and it's expensive. We have to make it clear that first and last mile, how people get home, how they get to a means of transportation. But more importantly, to this point, we have to be thinking about 2 generations down the road. The decisions we are making now will absolutely affect the folks that we haven't even met yet.
Thank you for bringing the last mile, because you're talking last mile thinking. I remind everybody the Q&A, if you take the Q&A button, you can ask questions to the panelists, and there will be a raffle for free tickets from Alaskan Airlines anywhere that they fly round trip. So please stay on for that at the end, and we'll be announcing the winner from the attendees today. You brought up a good point, by the way, last mile. So innovation, we're all thinking differently. We're all organizations thinking differently. I know Miller talked about the bike program and working with YMCAs across the country. The new Muni announcement on youth riders as well. So talk about, it's exciting. Talk about that innovation that you're bringing to the table now coming out of COVID. Please, I'll start with Miller if you want to go first, and especially public-private partnerships that you're talking about, Miller.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I think that was one of the silver linings in this very dark period of the last 18 months or so, is just the kind of ingenuity and innovation exhibited in large part by our city partners across the country and advocates who pushed to see in COVID an opportunity to reclaim space from cars and sort of accelerate a lot of the really good work that agencies across the country have been doing to reallocate space to people biking, walking, or taking space for public transit. Of course, the San Francisco's Open Streets program and those sorts of programs that happened all over the country were a prime example of that. And I think how we sort of saw our role as the operator of a bike share program is trying to lift up and highlight that amazing work that was happening, which was a political feat to get it done in the Bay Area and all around the country. It's never easy to take space from cars. As a former Safe Streets advocate, I can tell you it's a fight every time. So we surfaced Open Streets in our app and made it really accessible for our riders to find where their local slow street was, or open street. And it was a huge hit for our riders. We saw a ton of people riding to those areas and using them to connect to the infrastructure that had already been built out across the Bay. And I think that sort of momentum that was built during the pandemic is what's so to come out of it. It's not just enough to take that space, but about what comes next, whether it's bike superhighways or the kind of infrastructure that will build on the success that agencies around the country have had to get bike mode share and that first last mile connection to transit from the sort of margin where it's stubbornly been, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% of mode share to the 20, 30%. It takes that kind of leadership from folks like Director Tumlin and others around the country to take that space and make room for people biking. And then the bike share system will be there as the complement to be a funnel for people into that infrastructure.
Thanks, Miller. Jeff, do you want to take it next?
Sure. So on the downside, we were confronted by the worst financial crisis in our agency's 110-year history, compounded by a public health crisis, compounded by a racial justice reckoning. On the upside, the emergency order stripped away a lot of the bureaucracy that was designed to stop all change. So we were forced to adapt, and the rules allowed us to. So we focused a lot of our effort on health and efficiency. So for the transit system, we rebuilt Muni 4 times for a whole host of reasons. And among the innovations that we did, we've now built nearly 20 miles of new transit-only lanes in the last 12 months. On our main lines, Muni is 20% faster than it has been in our recorded history. We also eliminated schedules and adopted a technology called headway management that simply asks our drivers to space themselves out evenly between each other. So we have better reliability than I believe Muni has had in its 110-year history. So we've made the core system faster, more frequent, and more reliable because we were forced to by social distancing and by our health and economic crises. So the question now is, are we going to be allowed to hold on to any of these benefits? And will we have the resources to be able to sustain them? That's the fight that we're now pivoting to as we struggle to figure out how to recover, how much of the good we can hold on to, and whether we can hold on to any of the bureaucratic speeding up that demonstrated that government can actually get stuff done and be clear about its values if it's permitted to do so.
Thank you, Director. Latifa?
A couple of things. I do want to remark, I wish it was happening in my agency, but when San Francisco years back, and MTA and Google and activists and Coleman advocates and the bike, the bike advocacy community, so many folks came together around this idea of free Muni for youth, and there was a pilot. And what I know from that data, in the data from the pilot, there were all these unexpected things that happened. Like there was a 7% decrease in truancy among low-income kids. Like folks were able to get to school. I went to George Washington High School, but lived in the Fillmore. That's a long walk, right? If you don't have money to get on the bus for no fault of your own as a young person, right? Even with reduced fares. So there's this idea of mobility equity for young people who do not by themselves have access to resources all the time. It's extremely important that there is transit at their door and that is accessible. So just cheers to now the mayor's announcement yesterday. I'm just personally so touched by the understanding that it's not just free Muni, it's this idea of accessibility. San Francisco is one of the most beautiful cities on the planet, and these babies will be able to go anywhere. We're so afraid of young people, but if we think about what this idea that you're bringing a whole new generation into using public transportation. For BART, again, being inspired by some of the work that we've been seeing with other operators, including Muni, there's a number of things that we're doing now. We're actually raising resources to create a teacher field trip program. It's extremely expensive to take kids on BART, even though we have now a 50 to 70% discount for particular riders. When I came on the board, if you were 11, you were paying full price for a ticket. And that's why it's really important that we have representation of folks who really, who made that rule, right? So now young people pay at least half off to get on BART. But so much of what we've learned, again, is, being with other operators and developing initiatives. The MTC, which is our transportation commission in the region, they came together with Muni and others to create a program, a means-based program for low-income folks. 20% off BART might not seem like a lot, but if you're riding BART 5 days a week and you're low income, food stamp eligible, et cetera, it's like a day of free BART. We do need to get to the point, right, where it's not $10, $12, $14 a day to get to Antioch and back when you were born and raised in San Francisco, but you must live 50 miles away to be able to keep your minimum wage job. in San Francisco. We got to do better. If we're going to encourage people to get off the roads or actually just be a part of the workforce, to take care of themselves, to go to healthcare appointments, to go to court, we need to make sure, and I can go on, we need to make sure that people have access. And so much, I think, great thinking happened during COVID, where all of us had to, one, prioritize the transit dependent. We also had some opportunities and some struggles, again, around how we were thinking about race and place and who had access and who didn't. And I believe that ingenuity and that creativity, it's expected of us now. Our stations should be more beautiful. They should be more accessible. They should be more affordable. But you've also seen, Jeff, and you know this well, there's activists that now we're seeing who were never transit active, and they're at our meetings, they're yelling about restoration of service, which is happening. And that's an amazing thing, because transit touches everyone's lives. And we saw it during the pandemic in different ways. Folks have been able to get more civically involved because of accessibility through public meetings. I'll stop there.
Actually, let me dive in. I want to say one more thing, because Lateefah, you're so clear. You have such clarity about transit being access to opportunity. And so removing the fare barrier for those who need it, but also providing the service for those who need it. The most radical thing we probably did during COVID, as we were having to make the worst transit service cuts in the history of the agency, we also added a line, the 15 Bayview Hunters Point Express, which was the craziest thing to do, but it was a promise that we had made to community. And when we ran the numbers after we had added the line, we expanded the number of jobs accessible in a 30-minute transit commute to Hunters Point residents fourfold, and expanded the number of jobs ninefold within a 45-minute transit commute. And we were just dumbfounded by not only what we had achieved, but also Hunters Point was that cut off. Like the history that had led to this neighborhood being really the only neighborhood in San Francisco's entire history that had never had a one-seat ride to downtown, and to the employment and other opportunities that it offered, we realized, despite our resource constraint, that we owed it to the community to correct for 110 years of conscious disinvestment by the agency.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to transition to some Q&A at this point. Thank you so much. I know we have always limited time with such great panelists here, but to that point, Jeff, we have from Rufus says, kudos to Jeff and the SFMTA. Thank you for, this is a comment here from Rufus. Thank you for having the 15 Bayview Express. This new line is launched during the pandemic and a very positive example of equity and inclusion in addressing racial injustice issues. So props to you there. And let's just get to as many questions as we can while we can for the next maybe 5 more minutes or so before we do the drawing at the end. Here's one from Jeff Jones. Has any analysis been done about the amount of resources allocated to building infrastructure for cycling versus actual usage by San Franciscans? Miller, is this something you can answer perhaps?
I missed the last part of the question. Sorry, could you just repeat it?
Yeah, has there been any analysis been done about the amount of resources allocated to building infrastructure for cycling versus actual usage by San Franciscans?
Got it. It might be a question for Director Tumlin to speak on this overall topic of bike infrastructure, but happy to bike share portion.
Sorry, yeah.
We're fortunate that bike infrastructure is extraordinarily cheap, particularly the way that we do it, quick build style. So it costs very little compared to investment in really any other mode of transportation, including investing in pedestrians can be expensive. Moving curbs is one of the more expensive things that we do. So we get a very, very high return on investment in most of our relatively modest bike infrastructure.
Okay, great. We've got some other questions here from an anonymous person here. How have your agencies protected worker rights in this pandemic? How have your agencies been able to engage community and partners to provide feedback on the transit equity work? Anyone like to dive into that?
I'll start quickly. I believe in organized labor. I'm just going to say it, right? I think it's important in public systems that workers are protected. in the last year, again, because everything was on the line, it made so much sense that the 3 unions, actually the 4 unions, including the police union, which can be tough, came together and made concessions. But the concessions that we keep our people, folks. Some folks retired early. We had a 15-step plan to, again, bring writers back. We had a 7-step plan to make sure that our organization internally was going to last. And the unions came together in the pursuit of, again, protecting these public jobs for the public good. It takes 6 months to certify a train operator, right? And so again, if you fire 30% of them because there's a moment in time where no one's riding BART, well, I got to tell you, it's going to be really long headways. And we didn't do that. So we achieved labor peace, and again, extended contracts, because we do believe that there's, to Jeff's point, going to be a 3 to 5 year recovery process. Transit has changed for the foreseeable future. But it's also important in knowing that, BART is rebuilding its infrastructure. Someone talked about noise in the questions. We have an operating budget and we have a capital budget. We made sure that for staff that weren't too busy on the operating side, many of them went on the capital side, and they were in those tunnels, helping the engineers replace the tracks. There's so much happening, but it was important to make sure that the workers, that we weren't exacerbating the unemployment crisis. We knew, again, with the federal advocacy that we've all participated in, that it was going to be extremely tight and things were going to have to change. But here we are in the recovery with a strong workforce. So I think workers' rights is it's central. But again, these tough times, every agency did different things and had to make different decisions. There's no handbook to this. But now, as we will face, certain uncertainty moving forward, this crisis presents an opportunity for us to have real strong case study about, again, how to keep people moving in desperate times. Believe me, there will be more. Who knows what they will be, but we're moving through a crisis in a way that I think it's unprecedented, all of us.
Thank you. I think we might have room for 1 or 2 more. Well, here's one that was submitted a little bit earlier from Jeff. It says, on the subject of workforce development and equity, has any of these agencies here, have your boards tied executive level compensation bonuses to internal DEI metrics? How would you recommend a nonprofit organization incentivize DEI goals and outcomes? Maybe, I don't know, Miller, do you have any thought on that? Since I know Jeff and Lateefa have answered a question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously, like, aligning financial incentives with these, treating the whole project of DEI work as something, putting it on the same level as other business objectives is key to actually driving progress towards that goal. I'm not aware of executive bonuses to a specific question linked to those sorts of outcomes, but I think, at least, on our part as a company, we do take it incredibly seriously, both creating sort of an inclusive environment for the folks who work at the company already, and then obviously doing a lot of the sort of workforce development and training programs that I mentioned earlier. It's vitally important to building a successful organization, and especially in the realm of bike share operations, recruiting staff that reflect the communities where we operate.
And I'll end with this. We're along the same boats too. I don't know about any compensation per se for Alaska Airlines, but we are definitely making strides right now to have more diverse board members. We need more leaders that are diverse and representative of our workforce, and we need to fill these pipelines even more so. So I'll end with that. And I know we're up against time. We had always so much information, but so little time. But I want to thank all of you, Miller, Lateefa, Jeff. Thank you so much for engaging in this conversation with us here tonight at our town hall. And so with that said, we're going to close it out with, of course, a little bit of fun with a pair of round trip tickets, courtesy of us here at Alaska Airlines, for those who have stuck around and have really hopefully enjoyed this conversation with all of us. And so we'll close it out with a nice little prize, 2 round trip tickets anywhere Alaska flies, Hawaii, Mexico, Costa Rica.
What?
Yeah, anywhere you like.
Deal.
For the attendees, though.
I know. I was saying I'm gonna be in the next. I'm gonna be in the audience the next time if you're coming through like
There
that.
we go. Yeah. So thank you again to our panelists. But let us pick a random winner here for those who've stuck on board, and the winner is Danielle Tho. Is it Thoe? Danielle, congratulations. Let us know. Give us your email. I think we have all your contact info perhaps, but if you want to shoot us your email, we'll reach out to you and I will mail you personally your 2 round-trip tickets on Alaska Airlines. Thanks, everybody. Again, maybe I'll turn it over to Jamie to kind of close it out here, but thank you to our panelists. It's been an honor and pleasure to join you here this evening for the town hall.
Thank you, Franco, and thank you for the gift. And Danielle, congratulations as well. Mainly, equity equals access, and transportation is access and equity. So you represent organizations that really have been thoughtful, intentional, and I appreciate that. We appreciate you making life better for all of us in the Bay Area. So thanks for coming out tonight. Have a great night, everybody.